The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at Naval Air Station Pensacola as Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell stepped out of her rental car. The humid Florida air hit her like a wall, but it wasn't the heat that made her pause. It was the sight of her old flight suit hanging in the backseat. Faded, patched, and bearing the scars of countless missions, it looked nothing like the crisp uniforms she'd seen other officers wearing around the base dock. Today was different. Today, she wasn't Captain Mitchell, the desk-bound Pentagon analyst, who'd spent the last 3 years buried in classified reports and strategic planning documents. Today, she was attending the annual Naval Aviation Symposium, and for the first time in years, she'd chosen to wear her flight suit, the same one she'd worn during her deployments, the same one that had seen her through the darkest moments of her military career. As she walked toward the main conference building, Sarah couldn't help but notice the stares. Young officers in their pristine uniforms whispered among themselves, their eyes lingering on the worn patches on her shoulders, the faded name tape, and the slightly frayed edges where the fabric had endured one too many missions. She'd grown accustomed to the judgment over the years, but today it stung differently. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had earned her call sign Phoenix during her second deployment to Afghanistan. It wasn't just because she'd survived being shot down, though that was part of it. It was because every time the odds were stacked against her, every time her squadron faced impossible missions, she found a way to rise from the ashes of defeat and lead her team to victory. But those days felt like a lifetime ago now, buried beneath years of bureaucratic assignments and political maneuvering that had slowly eroded her connection to the warrior she once was. The conference hall buzzed with activity as hundreds of naval aviators, support personnel, and defense contractors mingled over coffee and continental breakfast. Sarah grabbed a cup of black coffee, the same way she'd drunk it in cockpits around the world, and found herself gravitating toward a group of younger officers discussing the latest fighter jet technologies. "Excuse me," one of them said, barely glancing at her worn flight suit, "but I think the civilian contractors are meeting in the adjacent hall." His tone was polite but dismissive, the kind of casual disrespect that had become all too familiar in her recent years behind a desk. "I'm Captain Mitchell," she replied evenly, taking a sip of her coffee. "I'm here for the symposium." The young lieutenant's eyes widened slightly as he took in her rank insignia, but his gaze quickly returned to her faded flight suit. "Oh, sorry, ma'am, I just ... Well, I figured you might be lost. That flight suit looks like it's seen better days." His comment drew chuckles from the other officers in the group. Sarah felt the familiar burn of embarrassment mixed with anger, but she'd learned long ago that reacting defensively only made things worse. Instead, she simply nodded and moved away, finding a quiet corner where she could observe the proceedings without drawing further attention to her appearance. As the morning progressed, the whispers and sideways glances continued. During the first panel discussion on innovation in modern naval aviation, Sarah found herself seated between a sharp-looking commander, whose uniform could have been used for recruitment posters, and a young pilot whose flight suit still had creases from the packaging. Both seemed to unconsciously lean away from her, as if her worn appearance might somehow tarnish their own professional image. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, surrounded by aviators discussing the future of naval aviation, and yet she felt more isolated than she had in years. These were supposed to be her people warriors who understood the weight of responsibility that came with strapping into a fighter jet and launching into harm's way. But the culture had changed, or perhaps she had changed, and the gap between her reality and theirs seemed to widen with each passing moment. During the lunch break, Sarah found herself standing alone near the windows overlooking the flight line. The sight of the aircraft A-18 Super Hornets gleaming in the afternoon sun stirred something deep inside her. She remembered the feeling of pre-flight checks, the controlled chaos of carrier operations, and the profound responsibility of leading young men and women into combat. Those memories felt both vivid and distant, like scenes from someone else's life. "That's quite a collection of patches you've got there," a voice said behind her. Sarah turned to see a senior chief petty officer, his own uniform bearing the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in service. Unlike the officer she'd encountered earlier, his expression held respect rather than judgment. "Thank you, Senior Chief," Sarah replied, glancing down at her flight suit. Each patch told a story: squadron deployments, combat missions, training. Exercises that had pushed her and her team to their limits. "They've been with me a long time, I can tell, ma'am. Real patches, not the kind you buy at the uniform shop." He extended his hand. "Senior Chief Rodriguez, I've been maintaining birds for 28 years, and I can always tell the difference between someone who's been there and someone who's just passing through." His words provided a momentary respite from the day's earlier encounters, but as the afternoon sessions began, Sarah found herself once again on the receiving end of subtle slights and dismissive glances. The combination of her worn flight suit and her current assignment seemed to mark her as someone who didn't quite belong in either world, not quite the warrior she once was, but not quite the staff officer others expected her to be. As the first day of the symposium drew to a close, Sarah stood in the parking lot, keys in hand, wondering if she'd made a mistake in coming. The flight suit that had once been her armor now felt like a costume, and the disconnect between her past and present seemed insurmountable. But something deep inside her, the same stubborn determination that had earned her the call sign Phoenix, told her that tomorrow would be different. She just didn't know how different it would be. The drive back to her hotel gave Sarah time to reflect on the day's events. But more importantly, it brought back memories of how she'd earned every patch, every faded thread, and every worn edge of the flight suit that had become such a source of judgment. The story of Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell wasn't one that could be read in her personnel file or gleaned from her current assignment. It was written in the scars of her aircraft, the loyalty of her squadron, and the respect of enemies who had learned to fear her call sign. Her journey to becoming Phoenix had begun 15 years earlier. Fresh out of the Naval Academy and Flight School, with the same crisp uniforms and eager attitude she'd observed in the young officers at today's symposium. Lieutenant Mitchell had been assigned to VFA 143, the Pukin Dogs, flying FA-18C Hornets, off the USS Enterprise. She was one of only 3 female pilots in the squadron, and the pressure to prove herself was immense. The first time she'd worn the flight suit that now drew such derision, it had been pristine, her name tape sharp and new, her patches freshly sewn with military precision. She'd been so proud of that uniform, spending extra time each morning ensuring every detail was perfect. But perfection, she would learn, was measured differently in combat than it was in the ready room. Her first deployment had been to the Persian Gulf, where routine patrols and show-of-force missions had given her valuable experience, but little opportunity to prove herself under fire. It was during her second deployment to Afghanistan in support of Operation Enduring Freedom that everything changed. The mountains of Afghanistan were unforgiving, and the enemy was adaptive and persistent. Sarah quickly learned that survival depended not on how crisp your uniform was, but on how quickly you could make life or death decisions in the face of uncertainty, the mission that would define her career and earn her the call sign. Phoenix came on a particularly brutal day. In October, her squadron had been tasked with providing close air support to a Marine unit that had been pinned down by Taliban forces in a valley northeast of Kandahar. The weather was marginal, with low clouds and intermittent rain making visual identification of targets extremely difficult. 2 previous strike packages had been forced to return to base without engaging, leaving the Marines in an increasingly desperate situation. Sarah was leading a 4-ship formation of Hornets when they received the emergency call. Any station. Any station, this is Groundhog 6. We are taking heavy fire from multiple positions. We have wounded and need immediate air support. Over. The desperation in the ground controller's voice was unmistakable. Sarah knew that her squadron's response could mean the difference between life and death for dozens of Marines. But as they approached the target area, the situation became increasingly complex. The enemy had positioned themselves in a series of caves and fortified positions that were difficult to distinguish from the surrounding terrain. Worse, the Marines were dangerously close to the enemy positions, making precision strikes extremely challenging. Phoenix, this is Groundhog 6. We need you to hit the cave complex at grid 41 SPR, 12,345 67,890. But be advised, we have friendlies within 200 meters of that position. 200 meters. In aviation terms, that was practically on top of each other. Any miscalculation, any slight error in targeting, and she could end up killing the very people she was trying to save. Sarah's wingman, Lieutenant Jake Slider Thompson, voiced what they were all thinking. Phoenix, that's danger close. We need to get clearance from higher. But there was no time for bureaucratic approval. The Marines were running out of ammunition, and more importantly, they were running out of time. Sarah made a decision that would haunt and define her for the rest of her career. Groundhog 6, Phoenix. Understand danger close. We're coming. In. What followed was a masterpiece of precision flying and tactical awareness. Sarah led her formation through multiple attack runs, each one requiring split-second decisions and absolute trust between pilot and aircraft. She dove her Hornet through the narrow valley, threading between mountain peaks while identifying targets and coordinating with ground forces. The enemy fire was intense, with surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery, creating a deadly gauntlet that claimed one of her wingmen. It was during the final attack run that disaster struck. Sarah's aircraft was hit by a surface-to-air missile, sending her Hornet into an uncontrolled spin. She fought to regain control, but the damage was too severe. With flames filling the cockpit and her aircraft breaking apart around her, she had only seconds to make a choice: eject over enemy territory or try to nurse her dying aircraft back to friendly lines. The decision to eject came at the last possible moment. Sarah's parachute had barely deployed when her FA-18 exploded in a fireball that lit up the Afghan sky. She landed in a rocky ravine, injured but alive, with enemy forces closing in on her position. What followed was 18 hours of the most intense combat experience of her life, as she evaded capture while directing rescue efforts and continuing to coordinate air support for the Marines she'd been trying to save. The rescue operation that followed became legendary within naval aviation circles. Sarah's squadron, led by her wingman Slider, refused to abandon their downed pilot. Despite being low on fuel and ammunition, they maintained continuous air cover over her position while a joint rescue team fought their way through enemy territory to reach her. The coordination between air and ground forces was flawless, and Sarah's calm radio communications throughout the ordeal became a textbook example of leadership under pressure. When the rescue helicopter finally lifted off with Sarah aboard, she was battered, bloodied, and exhausted. But she was alive, and more importantly, the Marines she'd risked everything to save were safe. The mission had been a success, but the cost had been high. Her aircraft was destroyed, her flight suit was torn and stained with blood, and she bore physical and emotional scars that would take years to heal. It was during her recovery that her squadron mates began calling her Phoenix. Like the mythical bird, she had risen from the ashes of destruction, reborn and stronger than before. The name stuck, and with it came a reputation that preceded her wherever she went in the naval aviation community. The weeks following, Sarah's rescue from Afghanistan marked the beginning of a transformation that would elevate her from a skilled pilot to a legend within naval aviation. Her recovery was not just physical, though the injuries from her ejection and subsequent ground combat were significant, but psychological and professional. The flight suit she now wore, faded and patched, bore the evidence of that transformation. In every thread, during her medical leave, Sarah could have easily requested a transfer to a less demanding assignment. Many pilots who had endured similar trauma chose paths that led away from combat operations. But something had changed in her during those 18 hours on the ground in Afghanistan. The experience had stripped away any illusions about the nature of warfare and her role within it. She had stared death in the face and emerged with a clarity of purpose that few warriors ever achieve. When she returned to duty 6 months later, her squadron barely recognized her. The eager young lieutenant who had left for Afghanistan had been replaced by someone harder, more focused, and utterly fearless. Her flight suit, which had been new and pristine before her deployment, now bore the patches and wear marks of her ordeal. She had refused to replace it, despite regulations that would have easily justified a new uniform. To Sarah, the worn fabric was a reminder of what she had overcome and what she was capable of achieving. Her first mission back was a routine patrol over the Persian Gulf, but even routine operations took on new meaning under her leadership. Sarah had developed an almost supernatural ability to read situations, to anticipate enemy movements, and to make split-second decisions that saved lives. Her squadron mates began to notice that missions led by Phoenix had a different quality to them. They were more successful, casualties were lower, and objectives were achieved with a precision that bordered on the miraculous. The reputation of Phoenix began to spread beyond her immediate squadron. Other units requested her expertise for particularly challenging missions. Intelligence officers sought her input on enemy tactics and capabilities. Even ground commanders who had never met her knew her call sign and the story behind it. The worn flight suit became part of her legend, a visual reminder that she had been tested in the crucible of combat and emerged victorious. It was during her third deployment that Sarah's reputation truly solidified. The mission was unlike anything she had attempted before, a deep strike operation against a heavily fortified enemy compound that housed a high-value target. The operation required not just exceptional flying skills, but also the ability to coordinate multiple aircraft, work with special operations forces on the ground, and adapt to rapidly changing circumstances. The target was located in a narrow mountain valley, surrounded by sophisticated air defense systems and protected by terrain that made conventional attack approaches nearly impossible. Previous reconnaissance missions had been unsuccessful, and satellite imagery showed that the enemy was continuously improving their defenses. The mission planners had identified a narrow window of opportunity, but it would require a level of precision and coordination that pushed the limits of what was considered possible. Sarah was chosen to lead the strike package not because she was the most senior pilot available, but because she had developed a reputation for achieving the impossible. Her call sign Phoenix had become synonymous with missions that others considered too dangerous or too complex. When briefing officers explained the mission parameters, they would often conclude with, "We need a Phoenix-level pilot for this one." The night of the mission, Sarah's flight suit bore additional patches from her previous deployments, each one representing a successful operation or a moment of exceptional performance. The fabric was now noticeably faded, and the edges showed signs of wear that no amount of maintenance could repair. But to Sarah and her squadron, these imperfections were badges of honor that no crisp new uniform could replicate. The strike mission itself became the stuff of legend. Sarah led her formation through enemy airspace with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. She coordinated with multiple aircraft types, managed complex timing requirements, and adapted to last-minute intelligence updates without missing a beat. When enemy fighters attempted to intercept her formation, she outmaneuvered them with tactics that would later be studied in military academies. The target was destroyed with surgical precision, and the entire strike package returned to base without a single loss. But more importantly, the mission saved the lives of dozens of coalition forces who had been threatened by the enemy compound. Sarah's leadership and tactical brilliance had turned what could have been a disaster into a complete success. Following the mission, Sarah was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors that could be bestowed upon a naval aviator. But for those who knew her, the real recognition came from her peers. Other pilots began to study her tactics. Ground crews competed for the opportunity to work on her aircraft, and young officers sought her mentorship. The worn flight suit became a symbol of authentic leadership and combat experience that no amount of formal training could provide. As Sarah's career progressed, she accumulated more patches, more awards, and more recognition. Each deployment brought new challenges and new opportunities to demonstrate her exceptional abilities. Her flight suit became increasingly worn, but also increasingly respected. Other pilots began to understand that the faded fabric and patched areas were not signs of neglect, but evidence of experience that could not be purchased or manufactured. The transformation from Lieutenant Mitchell to Captain Phoenix Mitchell was not just about military rank or professional achievement. It was about the development of a warrior ethos that transcended individual success and focused on the welfare of others. Sarah had learned that true leadership was not about having the newest equipment or the most pristine appearance. It was about having the courage to make difficult decisions, the skill to execute complex missions, and the wisdom to put the needs of others above personal comfort. By the time she received her orders to the Pentagon, Sarah had become one of the most respected officers in naval aviation. Her worn flight suit was recognized throughout the fleet as a symbol of authentic leadership and combat experience. But as she would discover at the symposium, respect within the operational community did not necessarily translate to acceptance. In the broader military bureaucracy where appearances often mattered more than substance, the story of Phoenix was far from over, and the events at the symposium would soon reveal just how much power there was in the reputation she had built. One mission at a time. But first, she would have to endure one more day of judgment, one more test of her resolve, before her true story could finally be told. The worn flight suit that had carried her through combat would soon face its greatest test, not against enemy fire, but against the prejudices of those who had never learned to look beyond the surface. The second day of the Naval Aviation Symposium began with the same humid Florida morning, but Sarah's approach was as different. Despite the previous day's experiences, she had made a conscious decision to wear her flight suit again, carrying with her the weight of every mission, every patch, every moment that had shaped her into the warrior she had become. Not out of defiance, but out of a quiet determination to honor the experiences and sacrifices that the worn fabric represented. As she walked through the hotel lobby, she caught her reflection in the mirror and saw not just the faded patches and worn edges, but the story of a warrior who had earned every thread. The morning session was focused on leadership in crisis situations, a topic that should have been perfectly suited to someone with Sarah's background. As participants filed into the auditorium, she noticed the same pattern of behavior from the previous day's subtle avoidance, whispered comments, and the occasional pointed glance at her appearance. She had hoped that her contributions to the previous day's discussions might have shifted perceptions, but if anything, the judgment seemed more pronounced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah chose a seat in the middle section, neither hiding in the back nor positioning herself prominently in the front. As the session began, the moderator, a crisp uniformed commander who looked like he'd stepped out of a recruiting poster, began discussing theoretical leadership scenarios. The irony was not lost on Sarah that she was listening to academic discussions about situations she had lived through. Decisions she had made when lives hung in the balance. During the first break, Sarah found herself standing alone near the coffee station when she overheard a conversation between two lieutenant commanders. They were discussing the previous day's events, and their comments cut deeply. "Did you see that captain in the ratty flight suit?" one of them said, not bothering to lower his voice significantly. "I heard she's some desk jockey from the Pentagon, trying to relive her glory days." "Yeah, I saw her," the other replied. "Probably hasn't been in a cockpit in years." You'd think someone would tell her that appearances matter, especially at a professional conference like this. "Maybe she's trying to make some kind of statement," the first officer continued. "You know how some of these older officers get, they think wearing their old gear makes them look more authentic or something. It's actually kind of embarrassing." Sarah felt the familiar burn of anger and embarrassment, but this time it was accompanied by something else, a profound sadness at how far the community had drifted from understanding what real service looked like. These officers, with their perfect uniforms and untested opinions, had no comprehension of what it meant to have fabric that had been through the fire of combat, patches that had been earned through blood and sacrifice. The morning session continued with a panel discussion on adapting to emerging threats, where Sarah's expertise would have been invaluable. She had faced adaptive enemies in multiple theaters, had seen firsthand how quickly tactical situations could evolve, and had developed strategies for dealing with uncertainty that were now being taught in military academies. But when the moderator asked for questions or comments from the audience, Sarah found herself hesitating. The previous day's experiences had created a psychological barrier that she was struggling to overcome. Every time she considered raising her hand to contribute, she could feel the weight of judgment from those around her. The expertise that had made her a legend in operational circles seemed diminished by the superficial assessments of her appearance. It was a cruel irony that in a room full of people discussing leadership and courage, she was being silenced by the very prejudices that effective leadership was supposed to overcome. During the lunch break, Sarah decided to walk the flight line, hoping to find some peace among the aircraft that had once been her natural environment. The sight of the FA-18 Super Hornets brought back memories of her operational days, when her expertise was measured by mission success rather than uniform appearance. She stood for a long moment in front of one particular aircraft, its sleek lines and powerful presence, a stark contrast to the political games being played in the conference halls. "Ma'am, are you supposed to be out here?" a young airman asked, approaching with the polite but firm manner of someone enforcing security protocols. "I have base access," Sarah replied, showing her conference credentials. "I'm Captain Mitchell, attending the symposium." The airman studied her worn flight suit with the same expression she'd seen countless times over the past 2 days. "Oh, okay, ma'am. It's just that ... Well, most of the officers from the conference are in their service uniforms. I wasn't sure if you were supposed to be here." Even the enlisted personnel were making assumptions based on her appearance. Sarah realized that her flight suit, which had once been a symbol of her authenticity and experience, had become a liability in environments where perception mattered more than performance. The disconnect between her operational credibility and her current professional image was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Returning to the afternoon session, Sarah found herself seated next to a young lieutenant who had been part of the group making dismissive comments the previous day. As the discussion turned to combat leadership, the lieutenant began sharing his thoughts on decision-making under pressure, clearly drawing from textbook knowledge rather than experience. "The key," he said during a small group discussion, "is to maintain situational awareness while processing multiple information streams. It's really about having the right training and staying calm under pressure." Sarah listened to his academic analysis of combat leadership, remembering the 18 hours she'd spent on the ground in Afghanistan, coordinating rescue efforts while evading enemy forces. She thought about the split-second decisions that had saved the lives of Marines, the weight of responsibility that came with leading others into combat, and the personal cost of carrying those experiences forward. "Have you ever been in combat?" she asked quietly. The lieutenant's expression shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no, not yet. But I've had extensive training in combat leadership principles. I'm actually scheduled for my first deployment next year." Sarah nodded without judgment. She remembered being in his position once, full of confidence and theoretical knowledge, unaware of how inadequate that preparation would prove to be when faced with real combat. But the difference was that she had understood her limitations and had been eager to learn from those with more experience. This new generation seemed to mistake academic knowledge for wisdom, appearance for substance. The afternoon session continued with increasingly theoretical discussions that bore little resemblance to the realities of military leadership. Sarah found herself withdrawing further, her contributions becoming less frequent as she struggled with the growing disconnect between her experiences and the environment around her. The worn flight suit that had once been her armor now felt like a burden, marking her as someone who didn't belong in this polished academic version of military professionalism. As the day concluded, Sarah stood in the parking lot once again, questioning whether she should return for the final day of the symposium. The experience had been professionally and personally demoralizing, and she wondered if her presence was serving any useful purpose. The respect she had earned in operational circles seemed to have no value in this context, and the judgment she faced was taking the toll on her confidence and sense of professional identity. But as she drove back to her hotel, Sarah's mind drifted to the young Marines she had saved in Afghanistan, the squadron mates who had trusted her with their lives, and the countless individuals who had benefited from her leadership over the years. Those experiences couldn't be diminished by the superficial judgments of people who had never faced real adversity. Her flight suit might be worn and faded, but the experiences it represented were more valuable than any pristine uniform could ever be. The question was whether she would have the opportunity to demonstrate that value, or whether the symposium would end with her voice silenced by the very prejudices that effective military leadership was supposed to overcome. Unknown to Sarah, the events of the final day would provide an answer to that question in ways she could never have imagined. But fate had a different plan, and tomorrow would bring someone who knew exactly who Phoenix was, someone whose very presence would transform judgment into recognition, dismissal into honor. The final day of the Naval Aviation Symposium arrived, with an electricity in the air that Sarah couldn't quite identify. Perhaps it was the anticipation of the closing ceremony, or maybe it was the knowledge that this would be her last opportunity to find meaning in what had become an increasingly disappointing experience. The worn flight suit that had carried her through 2 days of judgment would face its ultimate test today. As she dressed in the familiar fabric for the third consecutive day, Sarah made peace with the decision. If nothing else, she would leave the symposium with her integrity intact, having represented herself authentically rather than conforming to others' expectations. The morning session was dedicated to future directions in naval aviation, featuring presentations from senior leadership about strategic initiatives and technological developments. Sarah found herself seated in the same middle section she had occupied the previous day. But this time she noticed something different. The whispers and sideways glances seemed more muted, replaced by a sense of anticipation that she couldn't quite understand. The first speaker was Rear Admiral Jonathan Hayes, a respected leader known for his operational experience and forthright communication style. As he discussed the challenges facing naval aviation in the coming decade, Sarah found herself genuinely engaged with the content for the first time since the symposium began. Admiral Hayes spoke about the importance of combining technological advancement with operational wisdom, of learning from those who had faced real combat challenges. "The future of naval aviation," Admiral Hayes said, his voice carrying the authority, of someone who had earned his position through performance rather than politics, depends not just on our ability to develop new technologies, but on our capacity to learn from those who have tested our current capabilities in the crucible of combat. Experience matters, and we ignore the lessons of our combat veterans at our own peril. Sarah felt a spark of recognition in his words, but she had learned over the past 2 days not to expect too much from such statements. The gulf between official rhetoric and actual practice had become painfully apparent during her time at the symposium. The morning progressed with several more presentations, each touching on different aspects of naval aviation's future. Sarah contributed occasionally to the discussions, but she remained cautious about drawing attention to herself. The previous days had taught her that her appearance often overshadowed her expertise, and she was reluctant to subject herself to further judgment. It was during the coffee break that Sarah first noticed the increased security presence. Military police officers had positioned themselves at various points throughout the conference facility, and there seemed to be more coordination between the staff members than she had observed on previous days. When she asked a conference organizer about the heightened security, the response was vague but intriguing. "We have some distinguished visitors arriving for the closing ceremony," the organizer explained. "I can't provide specific details, but I can say that today's final session will be memorable." Sarah's curiosity was piqued, but she tried not to read too much into the comment. Military conferences often featured surprise guests, and she assumed it would be another senior officer delivering inspirational remarks about the future of naval aviation. As the morning session concluded, and participants began filing into the main auditorium for the closing ceremony, Sarah noticed that the seating arrangement had been modified. The front rows, which had been occupied by senior officers and distinguished guests throughout the symposium, were now blocked off by security personnel. The change suggested that whoever was arriving commanded significant respect and attention. Sarah found a seat in the middle section, as had become her habit, and waited for the ceremony to begin. The auditorium was packed with nearly 800 attendees, representing every aspect of naval aviation, from pilots and crew members to support personnel and contractors. The energy in the room was different from the previous days, more focused, more respectful, and charged with anticipation. The ceremony began with Admiral Hayes returning to the podium, his expression more serious than it had been during his morning presentation. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "it is my distinct honor to introduce our special guest for today's closing ceremony. This is someone who has dedicated his life to the service of our nation, who has earned the respect of allies and enemies alike, and who continues to set the standard for military excellence." Sarah felt the atmosphere in the room shift as Admiral Hayes paused, letting the anticipation build. Around her, officers were straightening in their seats, and the casual conversations that had been taking place throughout the symposium were replaced by respectful silence. "Please join me in welcoming General Marcus Thompson, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff." The auditorium erupted in applause as a distinguished figure in Air Force blue entered from the side of the stage. General Thompson was a legendary figure in military circles, known for his operational expertise, his commitment to military excellence, and his reputation for recognizing and rewarding authentic leadership. As a 4-star general holding the highest military position in the United States, his presence elevated the entire symposium to a level of significance that few had anticipated. Sarah felt a mixture of awe and nervousness as she joined the standing ovation. General Thompson's reputation preceded him, and she had heard stories of his leadership during some of the most challenging military operations of the past decade. He was known for his ability to cut through military bureaucracy and identify the real leaders within the ranks, regardless of their position or appearance. As General Thompson approached the podium, Sarah noticed that his eyes were scanning the audience with the practiced attention of someone who had spent decades evaluating military personnel. His presence commanded absolute respect, and the auditorium fell silent as he prepared to speak. "Thank you for that warm welcome," General Thompson began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned every star on his uniform. "I am honored to be here today to address some of the finest military aviators in the world. Naval aviation has always held a special place in our military hierarchy, and the men and women who serve in this community represent the very best of American military tradition." Sarah found herself hanging on every word, impressed by the general's ability to connect with his audience while maintaining the dignity and authority appropriate to his position. This was leadership of the highest order, and she felt privileged to witness it firsthand. "During my time in uniform," General Thompson continued, "I have had the opportunity to serve alongside warriors from every branch of the military. I have seen courage in its purest form, leadership under the most challenging circumstances, and sacrifice that humbles me to this day. I have also learned that true military excellence cannot be measured by appearances or conformity to bureaucratic standards. It can only be measured by performance under fire, by the willingness to put others before self, and by the capacity to rise to greatness when the stakes are highest." As he spoke, Sarah noticed that General Thompson's eyes continued to scan the audience as if he were looking for something or someone specific, his comments about military excellence resonating deeply with her own experiences and beliefs, and she found herself nodding in agreement with his assessment of authentic leadership. The general's speech was building toward something significant, and Sarah could feel the anticipation in the room growing with each passing moment. She had no idea that she was about to become the center of the most important lesson in military leadership that any of them would ever witness. The worn flight suit that had been dismissed and mocked was about to be honored by the highest levels of military command, and her story was about to become a catalyst for change that would ripple through the entire armed forces. General Thompson's speech continued with a gravity that seemed to permeate every corner of the auditorium. His words carried the weight of decades of military experience, and Sarah found herself completely absorbed in his message about authentic leadership and the true meaning of military service. "Throughout my career," the general continued, his voice measured and deliberate, "I have encountered individuals whose service transcends the ordinary, whose actions in combat have saved lives and shaped the outcome of critical operations. These warriors often carry the scars of their service, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, but always earned through sacrifice and dedication that most of us can barely comprehend." Sarah felt a strange sensation as the general spoke, as if his words were somehow directed at her personally. She glanced around the auditorium and noticed that other attendees were also hanging on every word, clearly moved by the general's message about recognizing authentic military excellence. "Today, I want to share with you the story of one such warrior," General Thompson said, his tone shifting to one of profound respect. "This is a story about a naval aviator whose call sign became legendary throughout the combat aviation community, whose leadership under fire saved countless lives, and whose dedication to duty exemplifies the very best of American military tradition." The auditorium fell into absolute silence as the general paused, allowing his words to sink in. Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, though she couldn't understand why. The general's description could apply to many combat veterans, and she tried to focus on the educational value of hearing about exemplary military service. "This aviator," General Thompson continued, "flew combat missions in multiple theaters, led rescue operations under impossible conditions, and demonstrated the kind of tactical brilliance that becomes the stuff of legend. But more than that, this officer embodied the warrior ethos that we all strive to achieve, the willingness to risk everything for the welfare of others, the courage to make impossible decisions under fire, and the leadership that inspires others to achieve greatness beyond their own limitations." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as the general's description became more specific. The details he was sharing sounded eerily familiar, but she told herself it was coincidence. Many combat aviators had similar experiences, similar stories of courage and sacrifice. The mission I want to tell you about took place in the mountains of Afghanistan, General Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the gravity of what he was describing. A Marine unit was pinned down by enemy forces, taking heavy casualties and running out of ammunition. The weather was marginal, the terrain was unforgiving, and previous air support missions had been forced to abort due to the extreme danger. Close nature of the situation. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. This wasn't a coincidence. The general was describing her mission, the one that had earned her the call sign Phoenix and changed the trajectory of her entire career. How could he know these details? And why was he sharing them with the entire symposium? The aviator leading the strike package that day made a decision that would be studied in military academies for years to come. General Thompson continued, his eyes now scanning the audience with increased intensity. Faced with the choice between following safe procedures and risking everything to save fellow warriors, this officer chose courage over caution, leadership over self-preservation. The auditorium remained absolutely silent, with 800 military personnel hanging on every word. Sarah felt as if she were reliving the mission all over again. The desperate radio calls from the Marines, the impossible weather conditions, the split-second decision to engage despite the danger-close parameters. The aircraft was hit by enemy fire during the final attack run, the general said, his voice carrying the tension of someone who understood the life-or-death nature of what he was describing. The aviator was forced to eject over enemy territory, beginning an 18-hour ordeal that would test every aspect of military training and personal courage. But even while evading capture and fighting for survival, this officer continued to coordinate rescue efforts and provide tactical guidance to friendly forces. Sarah's hands were trembling slightly as she gripped the armrests of her chair. She could feel the eyes of other attendees beginning to turn toward her, some recognizing the story, others beginning to piece together the implications of what they were hearing. The rescue operation that followed became legendary within the special operations community, General Thompson continued. The coordination between air and ground forces, the precision of the extraction, and the leadership demonstrated by the downed aviator throughout the ordeal set new standards for combat operations. But more than that, it saved the lives of dozens of Marines who would have died without that air support. The general paused, his eyes now fixed directly on Sarah's section of the auditorium. The weight of his gaze seemed to bore into her soul, and she realized that this was no coincidence. Somehow he had identified her in the audience, and this entire speech was leading to a moment that would change everything. The aviator I'm describing earned the call sign Phoenix that day, General Thompson said, his voice now carrying the authority of someone making an official pronouncement. Not just because of the ability to rise from the ashes of a destroyed aircraft, but because of the capacity to transform disaster into victory, to lead others through impossible circumstances, and to embody the warrior spirit that makes our military the finest fighting force in the world. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as the general's words washed over her. After 2 days of judgment and dismissal, of having her appearance criticized and her expertise questioned, she was hearing her story told by one of the most respected leaders in the American military. Phoenix went on to fly dozens of combat missions, leading strike packages against the most dangerous targets and training the next generation of naval aviators, the general continued. Every patch on that worn flight suit represents a mission accomplished, a life saved, or a moment of courage that made a difference in the outcome of combat operations. The auditorium was now completely silent, with every person present understanding that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Sarah could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, but for the first time in days, it didn't feel like judgment. It felt like recognition. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Thompson said, his voice rising with the authority of his position, "I have been searching this audience for the past few minutes, looking for someone whose appearance might not conform to the standards of a military symposium, someone whose uniform might show the wear and tear of actual combat service. I have been looking for Captain Sarah Mitchell, call sign Phoenix, and I believe I have found her." The general's eyes were now locked directly on Sarah's position, and she felt as if the entire world had stopped. 800 military personnel turned to follow his gaze, and she found herself at the center of attention in a way that she had never experienced. "Captain Mitchell," General Thompson said, his voice carrying across the auditorium with absolute clarity, "would you please stand and join me on stage?" Sarah felt as if she were moving through a dream as she rose from her seat. The worn flight suit that had been the source of so much judgment suddenly felt like the most appropriate uniform she could possibly wear. As she made her way toward the stage, she could hear the murmur of recognition from officers who knew her reputation, mixed with the surprised whispers of those who were only now realizing what they had witnessed over the past 2 days. The walk to the stage seemed to take forever, but finally Sarah found herself standing beside General Thompson, facing an audience that was now looking at her with a mixture of awe, respect, and in some cases, embarrassment. The general's presence beside her seemed to validate everything she had experienced, every mission she had flown, and every sacrifice she had made. "Captain Mitchell," General Thompson said, turning to face her with an expression of profound respect, "it is my honor to meet you. Your reputation precedes you throughout the military aviation community, and your service has been an inspiration to warriors across all branches of the armed forces." As the general extended his hand, Sarah noticed something that made her breath catch. He was not just offering a handshake, he was preparing to render a salute. A 4-star general, the highest-ranking officer in the United States military, was about to salute a captain whose appearance had been mocked and dismissed for the past 2 days. The moment seemed to stretch into eternity as General Thompson's hand moved to his forehead in a crisp, formal salute. The gesture was not just a recognition of her rank, but an acknowledgement of her service, her sacrifice, and her status as a warrior who had earned the respect of the highest levels of military leadership. Sarah returned the salute with precision and pride, her worn flight suit now feeling like the most distinguished uniform in the entire auditorium. As their salutes concluded, the general turned back to the audience, his expression carrying the weight of a lesson that transcended military protocol. "This, ladies and gentlemen," General Thompson said, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium, "is what a warrior looks like." The words hung in the air for a moment, their weight settling over the audience like a physical presence. Then, as if a dam had burst, the response came not just applause, but a recognition that would transform everything that had come before. The auditorium erupted in a way that Sarah had never experienced before. The general's words had shattered every preconception, every superficial judgment, every assumption that had been made over the past 2 days. 800 military personnel rose to their feet as one, their applause thundering through the space, with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. But this wasn't just applause, it was recognition, validation, and in many cases, a profound acknowledgement of respect that had been too long withheld. Sarah stood beside General Thompson, her worn flight suit now seeming to glow under the stage. Lights, every patch and faded thread telling its story to an audience that finally understood what they were seeing. The young officers who had dismissed her over the past 2 days were now applauding with expressions of dawning comprehension, their perfect uniforms suddenly seeming less important than the experience and sacrifice represented by her weathered appearance. General Thompson allowed the applause to continue for several long moments before raising his hand for silence. When the auditorium finally quieted, his expression carried the weight of someone who had delivered a lesson that transcended military protocol and struck at the heart of what it meant to serve. I want to share with you what I have learned about Captain Mitchell, the general said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent auditorium. When I was briefed on the attendees of this symposium, her name stood out not because of her current assignment at the Pentagon, but because of a reputation that has traveled through every level of military leadership. Phoenix is not just a call sign. It's a symbol of excellence that has inspired warriors across all branches of the armed forces. Sarah felt the weight of the general's words as he continued, each sentence adding layers of recognition that she had never expected to receive so publicly. The past 2 days of judgment and dismissal now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a moment of validation that felt almost surreal. Captain Mitchell's combat record includes 47 combat missions, 32 close air support sorties, and direct involvement in saving the lives of over 200 coalition personnel. General Thompson continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had access to the highest levels of military intelligence. Her tactical innovations have been incorporated into training programs across multiple service branches, and her leadership under fire has become a case study in military academies worldwide. The specificity of the general's knowledge was overwhelming. Sarah realized that her service had been tracked and evaluated at levels far beyond what she had ever imagined. The recognition was gratifying, but it was also humbling to understand that her actions had resonated so far beyond her immediate sphere of influence. But perhaps most importantly, General Thompson said, turning to look directly at Sarah, Captain Mitchell represents something that we must never lose sight of in our military culture. She represents the understanding that true excellence cannot be measured by appearance, that authentic leadership cannot be manufactured through bureaucratic processes, and that the warriors who have tested themselves in the crucible of combat deserve our respect regardless of how their uniforms look. The general's words hit the audience like a physical force. Sarah could see the impact on the faces of the officers who had judged her over the past 2 days, particularly the young lieutenant who had suggested she might be lost and looking for the civilian contractors meeting. His expression now carried a mixture of embarrassment and newfound respect that spoke to the power of the moment. I want to tell you about another aspect of Captain Mitchell's service that makes her presence here today particularly meaningful, General Thompson continued. After her combat deployments, she could have chosen any number of assignments that would have been personally rewarding and professionally safe. Instead, she volunteered for the most challenging staff positions, working on strategic initiatives that would benefit the next generation of military aviators. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as the general described her Pentagon assignment with a perspective she had never considered. The work she had been doing, buried in classified reports and strategic planning documents, had felt disconnected from her operational experience. But General Thompson was describing it as a continuation of her service, a way of using her combat experience to shape the future of military aviation. Her current work on next-generation combat tactics and pilot training protocols has the potential to save thousands of lives in future conflicts, the general said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the strategic implications of such work. The same warrior instincts that made her legendary in combat are now being applied to ensure that future generations of military aviators will be better prepared, better trained, and more likely to come home alive. The auditorium remained absolutely silent as the general's words sank in. Sarah realized that her career had been viewed from a completely different perspective by senior leadership, one that saw continuity and purpose where she had seen only bureaucratic disconnection from her operational roots. I have one more thing I want to share with you about Captain Mitchell, General Thompson said, his tone shifting to something even more personal. When I was a young officer, I had the opportunity to serve alongside her during a joint operation in the Middle East. I was a colonel then, and I watched her lead a strike package through one of the most complex air operations I had ever witnessed. Her tactical brilliance, her calm under pressure, and her absolute commitment to the welfare of her fellow warriors left an impression on me that has influenced my leadership style for the past decade. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she remembered the joint operation the general was describing. It had been a challenging mission, but she had never realized that it had been observed by someone who would later become the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The idea that her actions had influenced the leadership development of such a senior officer was both humbling and overwhelming. That mission taught me something that I have carried with me throughout my career, General Thompson continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal testimony. I learned that true leadership cannot be taught in classrooms or developed through bureaucratic processes. It can only be forged in the fire of real adversity, tested under the pressure of life and death decisions, and proven through the willingness to sacrifice everything for the welfare of others. The general paused, allowing his words to resonate through the auditorium. Sarah could see the impact on the faces of the audience, particularly the younger officers who were beginning to understand the implications of what they had witnessed over the past 2 days. This is why I am honored to be here today, General Thompson said, his voice rising with the authority of his position. Not just to speak about the future of naval aviation, but to ensure that we never forget the importance of recognizing and honoring the warriors who have earned their place in our military hierarchy through service, sacrifice, and excellence under fire. The general turned to Sarah, his expression carrying the weight of someone who was about to make a pronouncement that would resonate far beyond the walls of the auditorium. Captain Mitchell, your service has been an inspiration to warriors across all branches of the armed forces. Your courage, your leadership, and your dedication to duty represent the very best of American military tradition. It is my honor to serve alongside you, and my privilege to ensure that your contributions to our military excellence are recognized and celebrated. As General Thompson finished speaking, Sarah felt a profound sense of closure and validation. The past 2 days of judgment and dismissal had been transformed into a moment of recognition that would stay with her for the rest of her career. But more than that, she realized that her story had become a lesson for everyone present about the importance of looking beyond appearances to recognize authentic excellence. The auditorium began to stir with anticipation as everyone sensed that this extraordinary moment was building toward something even more significant. General Thompson's recognition had been profound, but Sarah could sense that the general was not finished with his message. General Thompson's expression grew more serious as he prepared to address the broader implications of what had just transpired. Sarah remained beside him on the stage, her worn flight suit now a symbol of authentic military excellence rather than a source of embarrassment. The audience sensed that the general was about to deliver a message that would resonate far beyond the walls of the auditorium. I want to address something that I observed during my time in this audience, General Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed something that concerned him deeply. Before I took the stage, I spent time walking through this conference, listening to conversations and observing interactions. What I saw troubled me profoundly, and it speaks to a problem that extends far beyond this symposium. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized what the general was about to address. He had witnessed the judgment and dismissal she had experienced, and he was about to confront it directly in front of the entire audience. I heard conversations about Captain Mitchell's appearance, the general continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who would not be deterred from speaking truth to power. I heard officers dismissing her contributions based on the appearance of her flight suit. I witnessed behavior that runs counter to everything we claim to value in military service. The auditorium fell into uncomfortable silence as the general's words hit their mark. Sarah could see the expressions of shame and embarrassment on the faces of those who had participated in the judgment she had experienced. The young lieutenant who had suggested she might be lost looked as if he wanted to disappear entirely. Let me be absolutely clear about something. General Thompson said, his voice rising with the authority of his position. "The officer standing beside me has earned more respect in her years of service than most of us will achieve in our entire careers. Her flight suit may be worn and faded, but it represents authentic military excellence in its purest form. Every patch, every thread, every sign of wear tells a story of service and sacrifice that should inspire us all." The general's words were not just a defense of Sarah's appearance. They were a fundamental challenge to the values and priorities that had been demonstrated throughout the symposium. Sarah realized that her experience had become a catalyst for addressing much deeper issues within military culture. "I want to tell you about the patches on Captain Mitchell's flight suit," General Thompson continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood their significance. "Each one represents a mission accomplished, a life saved, or a moment of courage that made a difference in the outcome of combat operations. They are not decorations, they are evidence of authentic military service." The general pointed to specific patches on Sarah's flight suit as he spoke, each gesture carrying the weight of profound respect. "This patch represents her deployment to Afghanistan, where she flew combat missions that saved the lives of coalition forces. This one represents her service in Iraq, where she led strike packages against some of the most dangerous targets in the theater. This one represents her work with Special Operations Forces, where her tactical expertise contributed to the success of classified missions that I cannot discuss publicly." Sarah felt overwhelmed by the general's detailed knowledge of her service record. It was clear that her career had been tracked and evaluated at the highest levels of military leadership, and that her contributions had been recognized even when she was unaware of it. "But I want to focus on one patch in particular, General," Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was about to share something deeply personal. "This patch represents the squadron she commanded during her final deployment, VFA 143, the Pukin Dogs. Under her leadership, that squadron achieved a mission success rate that has never been equaled in the history of naval aviation. More importantly, she brought every pilot home alive." The general's words carried the weight of someone who understood the profound responsibility of military leadership. Sarah remembered the weight of command, the sleepless nights worrying about her pilots, and the relief of successful missions that brought everyone home safely. "Every pilot who served under Captain Mitchell's command is alive today because of her leadership," General Thompson continued. "Her tactical expertise, her commitment to training, and her absolute dedication to the welfare of her subordinates created a culture of excellence that saved lives and accomplished impossible missions. This is the kind of leadership that our military depends on, and it cannot be measured by the appearance of a uniform." The auditorium remained absolutely silent as the general's words sank in. Sarah could see the impact on the faces of the younger officers, particularly those who had been dismissive of her contributions. The lesson was clear. Authentic military excellence was about performance, not appearance. "I want to share with you what I learned from Captain Mitchell during our joint operation," General Thompson said, his tone shifting to something more personal. "She demonstrated something that I had read about in military leadership manuals, but had never witnessed firsthand: the ability to inspire ordinary people to achieve extraordinary things. Her pilots would have followed her anywhere, not because of her rank or authority, but because they trusted her completely." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as the general described the relationship she had built with her squadron. Leading those pilots had been the most rewarding experience of her career, and knowing that it had been recognized at the highest levels of military leadership was profoundly moving. This trust was not built through bureaucratic processes or administrative excellence, the general continued. It was built through demonstrated competence under fire, through the willingness to share risks and hardships, and through the kind of authentic leadership that cannot be taught in classrooms or developed through theoretical training. The general paused, allowing his words to resonate through the auditorium. Sarah could see the impact on the faces of the audience, particularly the senior officers who were beginning to understand the implications of what they had witnessed. The lesson I want you to take from today is not just about Captain Mitchell's exceptional service, General Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was about to deliver a message that would resonate long after the symposium ended. The lesson is about the importance of recognizing authentic excellence wherever we find it, regardless of how it appears on the surface. The general's words were a fundamental challenge to the superficial judgments that had characterized much of the symposium. Sarah realized that her experience had become a catalyst for addressing deeper issues within military culture, issues that extended far beyond her personal situation. In our military, we often focus on appearances, on conformity, on the ability to navigate bureaucratic processes, General Thompson continued. But we must never forget that our ultimate success depends on warriors who have tested themselves in combat, who have demonstrated their ability to lead under impossible circumstances, and who have earned their place through service and sacrifice, rather than political maneuvering. The general's message was resonating powerfully with the audience, but Sarah could sense that he was building towards something even more significant. The recognition she had received was profound, but she sensed that the general was about to deliver a message that would have implications far beyond her personal situation. "This is why I am here today," General Thompson said, his voice rising with the authority of his position. "Not just to honor Captain Mitchell's exceptional service, but to ensure that we never forget the importance of recognizing and supporting the warriors who have earned their place through authentic military excellence." As General Thompson's words continued to resonate through the auditorium, Sarah could see a transformation taking place in the audience. The dismissive attitudes and superficial judgments that had characterized the past 2 days were giving way to something deeper, a recognition of authentic military excellence that transcended appearances and bureaucratic expectations. "I want to address the young officers in this audience directly," General Thompson said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had observed their behavior and found it wanting. "Your generation will inherit the responsibility of leading our military into the future, and the decisions you make about who to respect and who to dismiss will shape the effectiveness of our armed forces for decades to come." Sarah watched as the younger officers in the audience straightened in their seats, clearly understanding that they were about to receive a lesson that would stay with them for the rest of their careers. The lieutenant who had suggested she might be lost now looked as if he were trying to disappear entirely, his earlier confidence replaced by visible shame. Captain Mitchell's experience at this symposium should serve as a wake-up call for all of us, the general continued, his tone carrying the authority of someone who would not be deterred from speaking uncomfortable truths. A combat veteran with her record of excellence was dismissed and marginalized based on the appearance of her uniform. "This is not just wrong, it is dangerous to our military effectiveness." The general's words were having a profound impact on the audience. Sarah could see officers throughout the auditorium reassessing their own behavior, their own assumptions, and their own understanding of what constituted military excellence. The transformation was visible and immediate. "I want to share with you what real military leadership looks like," General Thompson said, turning to face Sarah directly. "It looks like someone who has been tested in combat and proven their ability to make life and death decisions under impossible circumstances. It looks like someone who has earned the respect of their subordinates through demonstrated competence rather than bureaucratic authority. It looks like someone who has sacrificed personal comfort and safety for the welfare of others." Sarah felt the weight of the general's words as he continued to describe the qualities that defined authentic military leadership. She realized that her experience at the symposium had become a teaching moment not just for her, but for everyone present. Real military leadership does not always come in a perfect uniform, the general continued, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. "It comes in flight suits that have been tested in combat, in boots that have walked through hostile territory, in equipment that has been proven under fire. These are not signs of unprofessionalism. They are badges of honor that should command our respect. The general's message was resonating powerfully with the audience, but Sarah could sense that he was building towards something even more significant. The recognition she had received was profound, but she sensed that the general was about to deliver a message that would have lasting implications for military culture. "I want to make an announcement that I had not originally planned to make today," General Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was about to make a decision that would surprise everyone present. "Captain Mitchell, your service has been so exceptional that I am personally recommending you for promotion to the rank of Major, effective immediately." The auditorium erupted in applause as the general's announcement sank in. Sarah felt as if she were in a dream as she realized that her career had just taken a dramatic turn. The promotion was not just recognition of her past service, it was validation of her potential for future leadership. "But more than that," General Thompson continued, raising his hand for silence, "I am recommending Captain Mitchell for assignment as the director of the new Combat Leadership Institute, a position that will allow her to share her expertise with the next generation of military aviators." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the implications of what the general was announcing. The Combat Leadership Institute was a prestigious assignment that would allow her to combine her operational experience with her strategic expertise, exactly the kind of position she had dreamed of but never dared to hope for. "This assignment will allow Major Mitchell to do what she does best," the general said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood her capabilities better than she understood them herself. "She will train the next generation of military aviators, sharing the tactical expertise and leadership skills that have made her legendary within the combat aviation community." The general's announcement was transforming not just Sarah's career, but the entire atmosphere of the symposium. The officers who had dismissed her over the past 2 days were now applauding her promotion, their expressions carrying a mixture of respect and embarrassment that spoke to the power of the moment. "I want to make one more announcement, General," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was about to deliver a message that would resonate far beyond the walls of the auditorium. "Effective immediately, I am establishing new guidelines for military symposiums and conferences that will ensure that combat veterans are recognized and respected regardless of their appearance or current assignment." The general's announcement was a direct response to what he had observed during the symposium, and it carried the weight of someone who was determined to prevent similar incidents from occurring in the future. Sarah realized that her experience had become a catalyst for systemic change within military culture. These guidelines will make it clear that discrimination based on the appearance of uniforms or equipment is not just inappropriate. It is a violation of military values that will not be tolerated, the general continued. "We will create a culture that recognizes and honors authentic military excellence wherever we find it." The general's words were having a profound impact on the audience, but Sarah could sense that he was building toward the culmination of his message. The recognition she had received was extraordinary, but she sensed that the general was about to deliver a final statement that would define the meaning of everything that had transpired. "Major Mitchell," the general said, turning to face her directly, "your service has been an inspiration to warriors across all branches of the armed forces. Your courage, your leadership, and your dedication to duty represent the very best of American military tradition. But more than that, your experience here today has become a lesson for all of us about the importance of recognizing authentic excellence and honoring those who have earned their place through service and sacrifice." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the general's words washed over her. The transformation from judgment to recognition, from dismissal to honor, was almost too much to process. The worn flight suit that had been the source of so much criticism now felt like the most distinguished uniform in the entire auditorium. "This is what a warrior looks like," General Thompson said, his voice carrying to every corner of the auditorium. "This is what authentic military excellence looks like. And this is what we must never forget to recognize and honor in our military culture." The general's final words were met with a standing ovation that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. But this time, the applause was different. It was not just recognition of Sarah's service, but acknowledgement of a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of the auditorium and into the future of military culture itself. As the applause continued, Sarah realized that her story was far from over. The recognition was just the beginning of a journey that would transform not just her own career, but the entire culture of military leadership. As the thunderous applause finally subsided, General Thompson made one final gesture that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their careers. He turned to Sarah, removed one of his own command pins, a small but significant token that represented his personal recognition of her service, and pinned it to her worn flight suit. "This pin represents more than personal recognition," the general said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the symbolic importance of the moment. "It represents a commitment to change, a promise that we will never again allow authentic military excellence to be dismissed based on superficial judgments. Wear it with pride, Major Mitchell, and know that it represents the respect of the entire military community." Sarah felt the weight of the pin as it was attached to her flight suit, but more than that, she felt the weight of responsibility that came with it. The general's recognition was not just personal, it was a call to action that would shape the rest of her career and influence military culture for years to come. As the ceremony concluded and the audience began to disperse, Sarah found herself surrounded by officers who had previously dismissed her. But now their approach was different, respectful, humble, and clearly influenced by what they had witnessed. The young lieutenant who had suggested she might be lost was among the first to approach. "Major Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned a profound lesson, "I owe you an apology. My behavior over the past 2 days was inexcusable, and I want you to know that I have learned something today that will stay with me for the rest of my career." Sarah looked at the young officer, seeing in his expression the kind of humility and recognition that could only come from witnessing authentic leadership in action. "Lieutenant," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood the importance of learning from mistakes. "We all make judgments based on limited information. What matters is our ability to learn and grow from those experiences." The lieutenant's expression carried visible relief as he realized that Sarah was not going to hold his earlier behavior against him. "Ma'am, I want you to know that I will never again make assumptions about someone's capabilities based on their appearance. Today has been a lesson that I will carry with me always." Similar conversations were taking place throughout the auditorium as officers approached Sarah to express their respect and, in many cases, their apologies for their earlier behavior. The transformation was visible and immediate, with the superficial judgments of the past 2 days giving way to genuine recognition of her expertise and experience. Senior Chief Rodriguez, the weathered petty officer who had been one of the few people to show her respect from the beginning, approached with a smile that spoke to his satisfaction with the day's events. "Major Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of someone who had seen justice done, "I've been maintaining aircraft for 28 years, and I've never seen anything like what just happened here today. You've changed this entire symposium and probably changed a lot of careers in the process." Sarah felt a profound sense of gratitude for the senior chief's early recognition of her authenticity. "Thank you, Senior Chief. Your respect meant more to me than you know, especially during those first difficult days." "Ma'am," the senior chief replied, "I could tell from the moment I saw you that you were the real deal. Those patches on your flight suit told a story that no amount of bureaucratic polish could replicate. I'm glad everyone else finally got to hear that story." As the afternoon progressed, Sarah found herself engaged in conversations that were completely different from those she had experienced during the previous 2 days. Officers were now seeking her expertise on tactical matters, asking for her insights on combat leadership, and expressing genuine interest in learning from her experiences. The transformation was remarkable and complete. Admiral Hayes, who had introduced General Thompson, approached with an expression of profound respect. "Major Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed something extraordinary, "I want to personally thank you for your service and for the lesson you've taught all of us today. Your experience here will influence how we conduct military symposiums and conferences for years to come." Sarah felt the weight of the Admiral's words as she realized that her experience had become a catalyst for systemic change within military culture. The recognition was gratifying, but the potential for lasting impact was even more meaningful. "Admiral," she replied, "I hope that my experience can help other combat veterans feel more welcome and respected in professional settings. We have so much to contribute, and it would be tragic if that expertise were dismissed based on superficial judgments." The Admiral nodded gravely. "You have my word that this will not happen again, at least not in any forum under my command. We will create an environment where authentic military excellence is recognized and honored, regardless of appearance or current assignment." As the day drew to a close, Sarah found herself standing once again on the flight line, but this time she was not alone. Several officers had joined her, including some who had been dismissive of her earlier, but were now seeking to understand her perspective and learn from her experiences. The sight of the FA-18 Super Hornets in the fading Florida sun brought back memories of her operational days, but now those memories were tinged with hope for the future. The new assignment that General Thompson had announced would allow her to share her expertise with the next generation of military aviators, ensuring that the lessons she had learned in combat would not be lost. "Major Mitchell," one of the younger officers said, his voice carrying the respect that had been absent from previous conversations, "I hope I have the opportunity to attend one of your courses at the Combat Leadership Institute. I realize now that I have a lot to learn about authentic military leadership." Sarah smiled, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing from her Pentagon assignment. "I look forward to sharing what I've learned," she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood the importance of mentoring the next generation. "But more than that, I look forward to learning from all of you. Leadership is not a one-way street, and I'm sure you'll teach me things that I never learned in combat." As the officers dispersed and Sarah prepared to leave the base, she took one last look at her reflection in the window of the conference building. The worn flight suit that had been the source of so much judgment now seemed to glow with recognition and respect. Every patch, every faded thread, every sign of wear told a story of service and sacrifice that had finally been acknowledged and honored. The drive back to her hotel gave Sarah time to process everything that had happened. In the space of 3 days, she had gone from being dismissed and marginalized to being recognized and promoted. But more than that, her experience had become a catalyst for change that would influence military culture for years to come. As she packed her worn flight suit that evening, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The fabric that had once been new and pristine now told the story of a warrior's career, every patch earned through service, every faded thread representing a moment of courage or sacrifice. The suit would continue to be part of her story, but now it would be worn with the pride and recognition it had always deserved. The next morning, as Sarah prepared to return to Washington to begin her new assignment, she received a message that would become one of her most treasured possessions. It was from General Thompson, and it read simply, "Major Mitchell, your service has been an inspiration to warriors across all branches of the armed forces. Your courage, your leadership, and your dedication to duty represent the very best of American military tradition. I am honored to serve alongside you, and I look forward to the impact you will have on the next generation of military aviators." The message was accompanied by an official announcement that would be distributed throughout the military: new guidelines for recognizing and honoring combat veterans, regardless of their appearance or current assignment. Sarah's experience at the symposium had become the catalyst for systemic change that would ensure other warriors would never face the kind of dismissal and judgment she had endured. As her plane lifted off from Pensacola, Sarah looked down at the base where her life had been transformed. The worn flight suit and her carry-on bag would soon be replaced by new uniforms appropriate to her new rank and assignment. But she would never forget the lessons learned during those 3 days in Florida. The story of Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell had become Major Sarah Mitchell, director of the Combat Leadership Institute, but more than that, it had become a lesson about the importance of recognizing authentic military excellence wherever it exists. Her worn flight suit had been mocked by those who failed to understand its significance, but ultimately it had been saluted by the highest levels of military leadership. The Phoenix had risen from the ashes once again, but this time she would ensure that other warriors would never have to face the fire alone. The story that had begun with judgment and dismissal was about to become something far greater, a catalyst for change that would ripple through the entire military community, transforming how authentic excellence was recognized and honored. Impact of Sarah's story at the Naval Aviation Symposium extended far beyond the walls of the conference center in Pensacola. Even as her plane lifted off from the Florida base, the ripple effects of General Thompson's recognition were already beginning to spread. Within hours of the general's speech, word had spread throughout the military aviation community, carried by the hundreds of officers who had witnessed the extraordinary events of that final day. Social media platforms used by military personnel buzzed with discussions about the Phoenix incident, as it came to be known, and the lessons it taught about recognizing authentic military excellence. Major Sarah Mitchell, she was still adjusting to her new rank, returned to the Pentagon to find that her story had preceded her. Officers who had previously viewed her as just another staff analyst now approached her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. The worn flight suit that had been the subject of so much judgment had become legendary, and requests poured in from military units across all branches asking her to speak about leadership, authenticity, and the importance of recognizing true military excellence. The first indication of how profoundly her experience had resonated came in the form of an email from Colonel James Patterson, the Air Force officer who had worked closely with her on several joint projects. "Sarah," he wrote, "I have to admit something that I'm not proud of. I've been working with you for 2 years, and I never fully understood the depth of your combat experience. Your personnel file showed your assignments and awards, but I never took the time to really understand what you had accomplished. After hearing about what happened at the symposium, I went back and read your complete service record. I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you the respect that you've always deserved." Colonel Patterson's message was followed by dozens of similar communications from colleagues throughout the Pentagon. Officers who had worked with Sarah for years were suddenly seeing her in a completely different light, not because she had changed, but because they had finally taken the time to understand who she really was and what she had accomplished. The transformation was most evident in the meetings and briefings that Sarah attended. Previously, her contributions had been politely acknowledged but not given the weight they deserved. Now when she spoke about combat tactics or pilot training, the room fell silent with the kind of respectful attention that was accorded to recognized experts. Her insights, which had always been valuable, were now being sought out and implemented at the highest levels of military planning. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Sarah viewed herself and her role within the military hierarchy. For years, she had struggled with the disconnect between her operational experience and her staff assignment, feeling as though she had been sidelined from the work that truly mattered. The recognition she had received from General Thompson and the subsequent respect from her colleagues had helped her understand that her current work was not a departure from her military service but a continuation of it in a different form. The new assignment to the Combat Leadership Institute represented more than just a promotion. It was an opportunity to influence the next generation of military aviators in ways that would have lasting impact on military effectiveness and operational success. Sarah began to see her transition from operational pilot to strategic planner, not as a loss of identity, but as an evolution of her service that would allow her to contribute to military excellence on a broader scale. The Institute itself was still in the planning stages, but Sarah's involvement in its development had already begun to shape its mission and approach. Working closely with General Thompson's staff, she was helping to design a curriculum that would combine theoretical knowledge with practical experience, ensuring that future military leaders would be prepared for the realities of combat rather than just the theories of warfare. One of the most significant aspects of the Institute's mission was its focus on recognizing and developing authentic leadership qualities regardless of conventional measures of success. Sarah's experience at the symposium had demonstrated the danger of superficial judgments, and the Institute would be designed to identify and nurture the kind of leadership that could only be developed through real-world experience and tested under pressure. The first indication of how the Institute would operate came in the form of a pilot program that Sarah was asked to design and implement. The program would bring together combat veterans from all branches of the military, regardless of their current rank or assignment, to share their experiences and insights with younger officers. The emphasis would be on authentic leadership rather than bureaucratic advancement, on substance rather than appearance. Sarah's first group of instructors included Senior Chief Rodriguez, the weathered petty officer who had recognized her authenticity from the beginning, and several other combat veterans whose uniforms might not have met traditional standards, but whose experience was invaluable. The message was clear. The Institute would judge instructors and students based on their contributions rather than their appearance, their wisdom rather than their rank. The response to the pilot program was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Young officers who had been struggling with the disconnect between their academic training and the realities of military service found themselves engaged with material that was both practical and inspiring. The stories shared by combat veterans provided context and meaning to theoretical concepts, while the emphasis on authentic leadership gave them a framework for understanding their own development as military professionals. One of the most powerful aspects of the program was its focus on the stories behind the uniforms. Each instructor was encouraged to share not just their tactical expertise, but the experiences that had shaped their understanding of leadership and service. Sarah's story of the symposium became one of the most frequently requested presentations, not because it was dramatic, but because it illustrated the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize authentic excellence. The impact of these stories extended far beyond the classroom. Young officers who had participated in the pilot program began to approach their own service with a different perspective, focusing on substance rather than appearance, on authentic achievement rather than bureaucratic advancement. The culture shift that General Thompson had called for was beginning to take hold. One officer at a time, Sarah's role in this transformation was both professional and personal. As director of the Combat Leadership Institute, she was responsible for shaping the curriculum and establishing the culture that would define the program. But as the person whose experience had catalyzed the entire initiative, she also served as a living example of the principles the Institute was designed to promote. The worn flight suit that had been the subject of so much judgment was now displayed in the Institute's main conference room, not as a museum piece, but as a reminder of the importance of recognizing authentic military excellence wherever it might be found. The patches and faded fabric told a story that no amount of bureaucratic polish could replicate, and young officers who visited the Institute were encouraged to understand the significance of what they were seeing. As Sarah settled into her new role, she began to understand that her experience at the symposium had been more than just a personal victory. It had been a catalyst for systemic change that would influence military culture for years to come. The recognition she had received from General Thompson had been important, but the lasting impact would be measured in the careers of the young officers who would be trained by the Institute and the culture they would create in their own units. Phoenix had indeed risen from the ashes, but this time she was not alone. The Institute would ensure that other warriors would have the opportunity to be recognized for their authentic contributions, regardless of how their uniforms looked or what their current assignments might be. And as the Institute's influence grew, so too did the recognition that Sarah's story was more than just a personal victory. It was a principle that would reshape military culture for generations to come. 6 months after the Naval Aviation Symposium, the Combat Leadership Institute had become one of the most sought-after assignments in the military. Officers from all branches were competing for the opportunity to attend Sarah's programs, and the waiting list for instructor positions had grown to include some of the most respected combat veterans in the armed forces. The Institute's reputation for developing authentic leadership had spread throughout the military community, and its graduates were already making their mark in operational units around the world. Sarah's typical day now began with a sunrise run around the Institute's campus, followed by meetings with instructors and students who brought challenges and insights that kept her constantly engaged with the evolving nature of military leadership. The contrast with her previous Pentagon assignment was stark. Instead of buried in classified reports and strategic planning documents, she was working directly with the people who would shape the future of military operations. The first graduating class of the Institute's full program included Lieutenant Jennifer Hawk Martinez, a young F-35 pilot who had arrived at the Institute with exceptional flying skills but limited understanding of combat leadership. During her time in the program, she had been mentored by Senior Chief Rodriguez and had learned to appreciate the value of experience over appearance, substance over superficial measures of success. "Major Mitchell," Lieutenant Martinez said during her final presentation, "when I first arrived here, I thought leadership was about having the right answers and maintaining perfect standards. But working with the instructors here has taught me that real leadership is about asking the right questions and recognizing that wisdom can come from unexpected sources." Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction as she listened to Lieutenant Martinez's presentation. The young officer had not just learned tactical skills or leadership theory, she had developed the kind of authentic understanding that could only come from exposure to real combat veterans who had tested their knowledge under fire. The Institute's approach to leadership development was fundamentally different from traditional military education. Instead of focusing on theoretical frameworks and bureaucratic processes, the curriculum emphasized practical experience, authentic storytelling, and the development of judgment under pressure. Students were encouraged to learn from the mistakes and successes of their instructors, to understand that military excellence was not about perfection, but about the ability to adapt and overcome challenges. One of the most popular courses at the Institute was titled Reading the Story, taught by Sarah herself. The course focused on the importance of understanding the experiences that shaped military professionals, of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize authentic excellence. Students were taught to read the signs of real combat experience, to understand the significance of worn equipment and weathered uniforms, and to recognize that the most valuable lessons often came from the most unexpected sources. "The story of every warrior is written in the details that most people never notice," Sarah would tell her students. "A patch might seem insignificant, but it represents a mission accomplished, a life saved, or a moment of courage that made a difference. A worn uniform might appear unprofessional, but it represents authentic service that cannot be replicated in a classroom or purchased at a uniform shop." The impact of this teaching was visible in the graduates who returned to their operational units with a different perspective on leadership and service. Instead of focusing on appearances and bureaucratic advancement, they were seeking out the combat veterans in their units, learning from their experiences, and developing the kind of authentic leadership that the Institute was designed to promote. Colonel Sarah Chun, an Air Force officer who had graduated from the Institute's first class, sent a report that illustrated the practical impact of the program. "Major Mitchell," she wrote, "I want to share what happened when I returned to my squadron. We had a maintenance chief who had been largely ignored by the previous leadership because his uniform was always a little worn, and his approach was more practical than theoretical. After attending your program, I made it a point to seek him out and learn from his 20 years of experience. His insights have improved our mission readiness by 30%, and his mentorship has transformed the way our young mechanics approach their work." Similar reports were coming in from graduates throughout the military. The Institute's emphasis on recognizing authentic excellence was having a ripple effect that extended far beyond the classroom, influencing how military units operated and how leaders were developed throughout the armed forces. The success of the Institute had also attracted attention from military leaders around the world. Delegations from allied nations were requesting briefings on the Institute's approach to leadership development, and several countries had begun implementing similar programs in their own military education systems. Sarah found herself traveling internationally to share the lessons learned from her experience and the principles that guided the Institute's mission. During one particularly memorable visit to the Royal Air Force College in England, Sarah was asked to address a group of senior officers about the importance of recognizing authentic military excellence. Her presentation included the story of her experience at the symposium, but she focused primarily on the lessons learned and the changes that had resulted from that experience. "The danger of superficial judgments," she told the British officers, "is not just that they hurt individuals, but that they deprive our military of the wisdom and experience that can only come from those who have been tested in combat. When we dismiss someone based on their appearance or current assignment, we may be ignoring the very expertise that could save lives and improve operational effectiveness." The British officers were particularly interested in the Institute's approach to identifying and developing authentic leadership qualities. Many of them had observed similar problems in their own military culture, where bureaucratic advancement was sometimes valued more highly than operational excellence. Sarah's presentation provided them with a framework for addressing these issues and developing a culture that valued substance over appearance. The international attention was gratifying, but Sarah's primary focus remained on the American military officers who were attending the Institute's programs. Each new class brought different challenges and opportunities, and she was constantly refining the curriculum to ensure that it remained relevant and effective. One of the most rewarding aspects of her work was the opportunity to mentor young officers who reminded her of herself at an earlier stage of her career. Lieutenant Commander Michael Razor Thompson, a naval aviator who had recently completed his first deployment, arrived at the Institute with exceptional technical skills but limited understanding of combat leadership. During his time in the program, he was mentored by several combat veterans who helped him understand the difference between flying ability and leadership capacity. "Major Mitchell," Lieutenant Commander Thompson said during his final evaluation, "I came here thinking I knew what military leadership was about. But working with the instructors here has taught me that I was confusing technical competence with leadership ability. I've learned that real leadership is about understanding people, making difficult decisions under pressure, and earning the respect of your subordinates through demonstrated competence rather than formal authority." The transformation in Lieutenant Commander Thompson was typical of what Sarah observed in most of the Institute students. They arrived with technical skills and theoretical knowledge, but they left with a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a military leader. More importantly, they developed the ability to recognize and learn from authentic military excellence wherever they encountered it. As Sarah reflected on the Institute's first year of operation, she realized that her experience at the symposium had been more than just a personal victory. It had been the catalyst for a transformation in military culture that was still gaining momentum. The recognition she had received from General Thompson had been important, but the lasting impact would be measured in the careers of the officers who were being trained by the Institute and the culture they would create in their own units. 2 years after the Naval Aviation Symposium that changed her life, Major Sarah Mitchell stood before a gathering of military leaders from around the world, knowing that her worn flight suit had become the symbol of a transformation that extended far beyond her personal experience. The Combat Leadership Institute had become a model for military education globally, and Sarah's story had become a case study in the importance of recognizing authentic military excellence. But as she prepared to address the audience at the International Military Leadership Conference, she was struck by how much had changed since that morning in Pensacola when she had first put on her worn flight suit. The conference was being held at the Naval War College, and the audience included generals, admirals, and senior officers from more than 30 countries. Sarah's presentation was titled "The Phoenix Principle: Recognizing Authentic Military Excellence in the Modern Era," and it would synthesize the lessons learned from her experience and the subsequent development of the Institute. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her true calling, "I want to tell you about a flight suit that changed military culture. Not because it was new or technologically advanced, but because it was worn, faded, and carried the authentic scars of combat service. This flight suit became the catalyst for a transformation in how we recognize and develop military leadership." As Sarah spoke, she displayed images from the Institute's programs, showing combat veterans working with young officers, sharing their experiences, and developing the kind of authentic leadership that could only come from real-world experience. The contrast with traditional military education was stark, and the audience was clearly engaged with the practical implications of what she was describing. "The Phoenix Principle," Sarah continued, "is based on the understanding that true military excellence often emerges from adversity, that authentic leadership is forged in the crucible of real challenges, and that the most valuable lessons are often learned from those whose uniforms show the wear of actual service. This principle has become the foundation of our approach to leadership development." The Institute's impact could be measured in concrete terms. Graduates of the program were being promoted at higher rates than their peers. Operational units led by Institute alumni were achieving better mission success rates, and the culture of recognizing authentic excellence was spreading throughout the military. But perhaps most importantly, the Institute had helped to bridge the gap between operational experience and strategic planning, ensuring that the lessons learned in combat were incorporated into the development of military policy and doctrine. Sarah's presentation included testimonials from graduates who had gone on to leadership positions throughout the military. Colonel Jennifer Martinez, the former F-35 pilot who had been in the Institute's first graduating class, was now commanding a fighter squadron and had implemented many of the principles she had learned during her time in the program. "Major Mitchell's teaching completely changed how I approach leadership," Colonel Martinez had written in her testimonial. "I learned to look beyond surface appearances and bureaucratic measures of success to identify the real sources of military excellence within my unit. As a result, I've been able to tap into expertise that I never would have recognized before, and my squadron's performance has improved dramatically." Similar testimonials came from graduates serving in every branch of the military and in positions ranging from tactical leadership to strategic planning. The Institute's emphasis on authentic leadership had created a network of officers who understood the importance of recognizing and developing real military excellence. Regardless of how it might appear on the surface, the international audience was particularly interested in how the Phoenix Principle could be applied to their own military cultures. Many of them had observed similar problems in their own armed forces, where bureaucratic advancement was sometimes valued more highly than operational excellence. Sarah's presentation provided them with a framework for addressing these issues and developing a culture that valued substance over appearance. During the question and answer session, a British general asked about the long-term sustainability of the Institute's approach. "Major Mitchell," he said, "your program seems to depend heavily on the availability of combat veterans with authentic experience. As conflicts end and these veterans retire, how do you ensure that the lessons they've learned are not lost?" Sarah's response reflected the evolution of her thinking about military leadership development. "General, that's exactly why the Institute's work is so important. We're not just training individual officers, we're creating a culture and a methodology that will ensure the lessons of combat experience are preserved and passed on to future generations. Our graduates become the carriers of this knowledge, and they ensure that the Phoenix Principle continues to influence military culture long after the original combat veterans have retired." The Institute had indeed evolved beyond its original focus on combat veterans to become a comprehensive approach to leadership development that emphasized authenticity, practical experience, and the recognition of excellence in all its forms. The worn flight suit that had started it all was still displayed in the Institute's main conference room, but it now served as a symbol of broader principles rather than just a single story dot. As Sarah concluded her presentation, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The dismissal and judgment she had experienced at the symposium had been painful, but it had also been the catalyst for changes that had influenced military culture at the highest levels. The recognition she had received from General Thompson had been important, but the lasting impact would be measured in the careers of the thousands of officers who had been trained by the Institute and the culture they would create in their own units. The Phoenix Principle had become more than just a teaching methodology. It had become a philosophy that emphasized the importance of looking beyond surface appearances to recognize authentic excellence. This philosophy was now being implemented in military education programs around the world, and its influence was spreading to civilian leadership development as well. After the conference, Sarah received a message from General Thompson, who had been following the Institute's progress with great interest. "Major Mitchell," he wrote, "I want you to know that your work has exceeded every expectation I had when I first recommended you for this assignment. The Institute has become a model for military leadership development, and your influence has spread far beyond what any of us imagined possible. The Phoenix Principle is now being studied and implemented by military organizations around the world, and your story has become a powerful example of how authentic excellence can triumph over superficial judgments." The general's message was accompanied by news that Sarah had been selected for promotion to lieutenant colonel, effective immediately. But more importantly, he announced that the Institute would be expanding its programs to include a new initiative focused on developing the next generation of military leaders who would carry forward the principles of authentic excellence. As Sarah read the message, she thought about the worn flight suit that had started it all, about the young officers who had dismissed her based on her appearance, and about the profound transformation that had resulted from those difficult days. In Pensacola, the Phoenix had indeed risen from the ashes, but this time she had brought others with her, creating a legacy that would influence military culture for generations to come. The story of Captain Sarah Phoenix Mitchell had become Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, but more importantly, it had become a principle that would ensure that future warriors would be recognized for their authentic contributions rather than their superficial appearances. The Combat Leadership Institute would continue to develop leaders who understood that true military excellence could not be measured by the newness of a uniform or the polish of bureaucratic advancement, but only by the depth of experience, the authenticity of service, and the courage to lead others through the most challenging circumstances. The Phoenix had risen, and her flight would inspire others to soar for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.